Hello, I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, president of the Salisbury Forum. We're very happy to have you with us this evening. For those of you who aren't familiar with the forum, we're based in the town of Salisbury in the northwest corner of Connecticut. We sponsor nationally recognized speakers in free public forums. You can go to our homepage at salisburyforum.org to watch videos of our past talks. Join our email list or check out our Facebook page or get informed about upcoming events. So we hope you will keep following us and enjoy our talks. On Friday, November 20th at 7:30, our speaker will be Adam Gopnik. He's well known as an author and staff writer for The New Yorker. While he's written about an amazing diversity of topics over the years, given that his talk is going to be coming right after the election, his topic this time will be the end of the world or the last faint hope. We hope you'll join us. We'll begin our annual fundraising appeal at the end of this month. And while our presentations have gone virtual, we still incur most of the costs of our in-person lectures. I know that you're getting inundated with requests for donations, but we rely on contributions from our audience, from people like you, to be able to continue to keep our programs free to the public. So we're really grateful for any donation you might want to make. For the Q&A this evening, click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type in any questions you may want to have. During tonight's program, a few brief poll questions will pop up. Once you've answered them, they'll disappear and the program will continue. So now I want to invite Casper to join us.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're so pleased to have Casper ter Kuile with us tonight. Casper holds Masters of Divinity and Public Policy degrees from Harvard University, and he remains a Ministry Innovation Fellow at Harvard Divinity School. He hosts award-winning podcasts Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where he uses episodes in the books to illustrate issues such as belonging, identity, grief, and independence. He's a co-founder of the startup Sacred Design Lab and former director of possibility at the On Being Impact Lab. His work has been featured on PBS and in numerous national newspapers. He's the co-author of the seminal paper, How We Gather, and has presented his research at venues like the Aspen Ideas Festival, Institute for the Future, and the Cannes Lions Festival. His work focuses on our crisis of social isolation and longing for connection, exploring the potential futures for religion and relationships in the 21st century. His new book, The Power of Ritual, Turning Everyday Activities into Soulful Practices, is available with signed book plates at Oblong Books and Music in Millerton, New York. So with that, I want to welcome Casper to the Salisbury Forum.
Thank you so much, Mary. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in this evening. I've been promised a fiercely intelligent audience, so I look forward already to the questions and the conversation that we'll have later on. For now, I'd so welcome, if you can, add into the chat box where you're dialing in from. That'll give us a good sense of where everyone is and a chance to say hello to you. So I'm so glad that you're here. And as Mary said, my name's Casper ter Kuile. I really spend my time thinking about the future of religion and the future of community in the United States. So what I'm going to talk through this evening are some of the trends that we're seeing around religious identity and social connection, and then think about why these trends are happening and what they might mean for the future of both religion and community. So we've got a lot of folks telling us where they're from. Welcome. We've got Kelly in Norfolk, Phillips in Lakeville, Patricia is in New York City, Maeve in Lakeville as well. Wonderful. Great to have you all here. Barry and Kathleen and Eileen, wonderful. Thank you so much for saying hello. It always makes it a little more real for us presenters to know that you're out there. Thank you for that. So I'm going to share my screen, which will take you through just a couple of slides as we dig into these themes. And as I said, there'll be a couple of polls just to get your feedback and a sense of the room, as it were. And then we'll have plenty of conversation towards the end of the hour. So what I want to set before kind of we dig into the why is the what is going on? What are these trends in terms of religion and social connection? The first is that more and more people are less and less religious. This graph illustrates how that distributes across generation. So if you look at folks on the right-hand side of the graph, folks who are older, they're much more likely to be religious, right? There's a lower rate of disaffiliation. And on the left-hand side of the graph, you see younger people, more and more likely to be disaffiliated. And just to clarify, what we mean by disaffiliation is when people are asked in a survey, how do you identify religiously? And there's lots of boxes that you can tick: Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, Jewish, you know, all the different boxes. And the box that says none of the above, that's the box that more and more people are ticking. And so at this point, nearly 40% of people my age, the millennial generation, is now unaffiliated. 40%, an enormous shift very, very quickly. And for the generation after me, 18, 19-year-olds today, we think that might be as high as 50%. So a real sea change in how people are identifying religiously in just a few generations. So I'm curious, we're going to launch the first poll. I want to get a sense of our group here today. How would you describe your congregational attendance? So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen for a moment, and you should see a poll pop up very soon that will ask you to share how you would describe your congregational attendance. It's completely anonymous, so you can add the answer that applies to you. Option 1 is that you're a committed or regular attendee of a church or synagogue or a mosque. Option 2 says semi-regular, but definitely a member of a religious congregation. Third option is that you might join once or twice a year. And then the final option is that you don't attend a congregation. So we'll just give everyone a couple of moments to fill that in. The answers are coming in. I can see more than half of you have already responded. So we'll share that information once we've got the full sense of where everyone's at. And it's so interesting, particularly to think about this conversation in terms of America. I, of course, am not American, as you can probably hear from my accent. I was born and raised in England, which is much, much more secular than the United States, even though, of course, the head of the state is also the head of the Church of England. It's a rather unusual system. But my parents are both Dutch, and I think along with Denmark, Holland is the most secular country in the world. And you can see the results will be shared with you in just a moment. We have a tight winner in that in first place, we have with 34% of the vote that you don't go to a congregation. Not far behind, committed and regular attendees of a house of worship. And after that, in pretty close succession, semi-regular and once or twice a year join us. So we've got a nice spread of what the American religious landscape looks like right now. And absolutely, Janet, that graph was just for the US only, and I will be talking only about the United States this evening, although a lot of these trends you can track across the Western world. So let me take you through to the next slide. At the same time as we're seeing this rapid disaffiliation, we're also seeing a rise in the experience of social isolation and loneliness. What you're looking at here is a graph that looks at the percentage of American adults who live alone. And this is one of the contributing factors to the growth in social isolation. The difference between social isolation and loneliness is that social isolation is the structural reasons for why we are spending more time on our own, living alone being one of them, working from home being another, higher rates of marrying later or being divorced or separated. So these are some of the structural reasons why we're spending more time alone. Loneliness is the qualitative experience of not having the type or the rich relationships that we would want to have. So you can be socially isolated but not lonely. And indeed, you can be surrounded by people and still experience that sense of loneliness because you're not having the type of relationship or the experience or the quality of relationship that you'd want to have. So what I hope to argue for today is that I think these two things are connected, that the traditional structures of community, the structures of relationship in which congregations and religious institutions were absolutely central are really struggling. And I think because of that, we're seeing a rise both in social isolation and in loneliness. But it's not a story of doom and gloom, I promise. I want to illustrate also some of the new organizations that are rising around the United States that are fulfilling perhaps some of the roles that a religious congregation used to do. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But so these are the trends. This is the kind of context for the conversation that we're going to have this evening. A rise in disaffiliation and therefore a rise in social isolation. And this is having all sorts of impacts on religious institutions. 3,500 Christian churches close every year, an extraordinary number. In a Jewish context, that looks a little different. The data suggests that 70% of non-Orthodox Jews marry outside of the faith. So for a lot of Jewish institutions, the last 20 years or so we're very worried about intermarriage. So that's a way in which this is playing out in the Jewish context. But it's important to contextualize these religious trends within a broader cultural sphere. Trust in government, trust in media. I mean, honestly, even trust in medical institutions is down, although we'll have to see what the impact of COVID is on that. So I don't want us to focus with any sort of cruelty just on the religious institutions. There's a growing shift in how, especially younger Americans, engage institutions. But one way I've heard it said that really resonated with me is that trust in institutions is down, but trust in individual public figures has increased. So you might think about the rise of the Instagram influencer as one example, where we're looking to individuals that we feel we can have some sort of connection with, even though we're less likely to affiliate with an institution. So these trends are having huge impacts on institutions, but they're also having impacts on individuals. As more and more people are less and less religious in terms of how they describe themselves, it doesn't mean that it has necessarily hugely impacted what they believe or what they practice. So 2 in 3 people who describe themselves as non-religious still say that they believe in God or a higher power. 1 in 5 of them even pray every day. So we're seeing a sort of spiritually homeless group of people who still have a real overt sense of religiosity or spirituality, but they're not members of congregations. And at the same time, that impact of social isolation and loneliness is extremely real. 1 in 4 Americans say that they have nobody to talk to about the things that are most important to them. 1 in 4. That includes a spouse, a partner, children, friends, family. So there's a deep fraying of the relational fabric, and I would contend that that is one of the contributors to the political landscape that we have now. That fraying of relationship has escalated the polarization. So those are some of the indicators on an individual level, and it goes further. You know, we're seeing climbing rates of stress and anxiety and depression. Suicide rates in America are at a 30-year high. And the impact of loneliness isn't just one that is, sad. It actually has an impact on our mortality. Julianne Holt-Lundstad at Brigham Young University a few years ago did a meta-analysis of more than 70 studies in which she discovered that loneliness reduces life expectancy more than obesity or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So this has all sorts of impacts on our health and well-being and even our mortality. So that's what's happening to us. And so I want to ask a second poll just to get a sense of how you see this happening in your life. Does this resonate? So the question now is, how much social isolation and loneliness do you see in your own life? And we'll have that second poll coming up now. Again, I'll invite you to vote. It's so helpful to get a sense of where everyone's own life experience is. So in this poll, the question is, how much social isolation and loneliness do you see in your own life? Option 1 is, these issues impact me most of all. Option 2 is, I see friends and loved ones suffering from these issues most of all. And then the third one, social isolation and loneliness don't impact me or the ones I love. So please do vote. It's always so helpful to get a sense of where we all are. And again, these are trends that specifically about the US, but I think that a similar story can be told elsewhere. Now, the first thing I would say is, whatever the results are when they come back, the fact that you're here, whether it's you're a long-time member and participant of the Salisbury Forum or someone who's joining us for the first time, already suggests that you're more likely to be engaged with community than most. So we'll see if that's represented in the data. So I'll just give you another second. I think we've got about 85% of you have already voted. Excellent. here we go. So the winner here, which is wonderful to see, social isolation and loneliness don't impact me or the ones I love. And you can see the results. We'll share them in just a moment. There we go. One of the interesting things is, again, loneliness is generationally distributed unequally. So it's those Gen Zs, those youngest people who are now college age and younger, who are the most lonely generation. There's many conversations to be had about the role of technology, but we're not going to go there this evening. But again, so it's interesting to see that as people affiliate less and less with religion, we're also seeing that generational shift in how people experience loneliness. Okay, wonderful. All right, let's dig into the next slides. So why is this happening? What is going on? One of the key ideas I want to share with you this evening is the idea of unbundling and remixing. Now that sounds a little strange perhaps when we're thinking about community life, but let me explain what I mean. If you think, let's say half a century ago, the newspaper was everywhere. You had local newspapers in every town. Large newspapers would have multiple printings a day. Here is a lovely picture of a busy subway car where everyone has their nose in the newspaper. You might think of an equivalent situation today. And what I'm interested in thinking about is what were the different bits of value that were bundled together into the single offering of the newspaper. So thinking about what were the reasons why people would read a newspaper. It would include, of course, the news, sports headlines. It would include a quiz or perhaps a crossword that you might enjoy in your commute. It would have perhaps house prices, personal ads, all sorts of reasons why people would come to the newspaper. Well, today, because of the advances in technology, and here you see a home screen of an iPhone, each of those different individual pieces of value has been unbundled and created into its own app. So you can get the latest headlines in a rolling CNN feed. You can not only get the sports scores, you can watch a game on your ESPN app. You have endless Sudoku puzzles in an app, right? So each of those individual pieces, you can get house prices for the whole country. You can personalize. You can choose which region you want. You can specify what kind of news you want to see. Each of these apps is doing a better job individually than a newspaper as a static thing could do as a whole. Now, I want to be very careful. The newspaper as a printed kind of piece of culture still has value. For me, there's nothing more wonderful than on a Sunday morning, reading my New York Review of Books or the LRB in bed and not looking at a screen. So I'm not saying that the newspaper has no value, but the reasons why people turned to it before are no longer the reasons people turn to it now, because each of those individual bits of value have been unbundled into the ubiquitous smartphone. So what I want to ask you now is to once again engage the chat box where you so kindly shared where you were from, because I want you to think about what might people have come to congregations for. If we think about a congregation just like that newspaper, what were the different pieces of value that were bundled together, and of course still are, bundled together in a congregation? So if you want to add to the chat box, any ideas are good. There's no wrong answers. I would love to hear why do and have people gone to congregations? What is it that they were looking for? Love it. Kate saying, yeah, social connection. Absolutely. A sense of community. Eileen, absolutely. Sarah talks about the news of the community. Absolutely. Look at this. Fantastic. Oh, this is so great. Sophia, yes, shared values, a sense of spirituality, perhaps sharing spiritual practices. Sarah also mentions, who mentioned that? Carol mentioned singing. Patricia, spiritual guidance. Barry, worship of the divine. Kate, an opportunity to be of service to other people. Absolutely. Organizing together to make changes in the local community, in the wider world. Lots of answers of fellowship. I love this from Philip. Business connections, absolutely. If you think about the Black Church, for example, an absolute center not only of professional connections, but also political organizing. Kelly, holiday rituals, absolutely. Marking time across a calendar. I love this from Frank. Yes, social pressure in a one religion neighborhood. Absolutely. You know, you could be shunned from the community if you didn't participate in the religious congregation. So you can see, although it was one community, one offering into the outside world, there were many, 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 and of course still are, many reasons why people were drawn to one congregation. We might also think about a couple of others. For example, a sense of identity, a connection to history, a sense of peoplehood, right? Of being part of a longer story. I love this, Maureen. Yes, the indoctrination of children to your beliefs, but that sense of an intergenerational connection, absolutely one of them. A sense of moral education. You can think of Sunday school, but even for adults, a sense of practicing values or of learning, you know, stories, wisdom stories and wisdom teachings. We talked about prayer, we talked about worship, rites of passage, right? The kind of classic hatched, matched, and dispatched, as they like to say in the Church of England. The sense of, you know, marking time at weddings. Exactly, Divya mentions rituals, those rituals of birth, of marriage, of death, and many others, of course. A space for grieving, I saw a couple of you mention that. And of course, celebration. A sense of contemplative time, a space to be quiet, to reflect. All of these things were bundled up into congregational life. And so what I want to suggest to you is, just like what we saw with the newspaper being unbundled into all of those different apps, one of the trends that's happening within religious life is that all of those values that were bundled together in congregational life are too being unbundled. So people might be meeting more and more friends, for example, in their work life. One of the trends that we're seeing is that younger employees especially are approaching the workplace as a place where they expect to find community. They also expect to find meaning and purpose, a sense of being able to put their values into practice, of having an impact on the world in their workplace rather than their congregational life. People who might be looking for a way to connect with something more spiritual or something that's bigger than them are maybe drawn towards nature, right? Might be in canoeing or hiking or travel, that people are looking for that sense of a wider connection. People are listening to podcasts or watching TED Talks instead of listening to sermons. So you can start to see how each of these different pieces, that they're joining the Sierra Club, that they're marching in the streets for Pride or Black Lives Matter, rather than taking action as a congregation, they're doing it in secular nonprofit organizations. So you can start to see how, when we look at the unbundling of the congregation, people are finding these things that are specific to them outside of congregational life. And here's the other piece. As you kind of unbundle, you can remix something that makes it all the more personal to you. So rather than having to accept the whole of the congregation, people are only downloading the apps, if you will, that they want, right? So you might be able to create the perfect profile for you. Perhaps you're in an interfaith marriage and you're able to kind of put together the Hindu and the Jewish celebrations that are important to your family. Perhaps you're really into hiking, but you also really appreciate, gosh, who knows what it is, classical music. And so you can make your own kind of communities perfectly matched to you. But the challenge is that the more that we personalize, the less that we share. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing that growth in loneliness and social isolation, that the more people build something that's directly meant for them, they don't have other people in that community who they share those other bits of their lives with. So you might have something that's more and more tailored, but less and less shared. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this move. So those are some of that's one of the kind of central analyzing tools that I found extremely helpful to think about unbundling the congregation and then remixing it to your individual kind of taste profile, you can imagine. But at the same time that we're seeing that unbundling and remixing, and I will share my screen once again, we're seeing a new landscape of meaning-making communities emerging. Because I believe something we've seen across our research is that that sense of isolation or that sense of loneliness is experienced very deeply, and people are hungry for community. They're looking for it in all sorts of unlikely places. I want to tell you a couple of stories in the research that we did, where we saw how that community hunger came through. This is a CrossFit gym. The first thing I want to ask is, do we have any CrossFitters with us? Because it is always wonderful and fascinating to know if there are any people who do CrossFit, because we'll get a real sense of someone's personal experience. So if you are a CrossFitter, please add that to the chat, and we'll hear more from you in a moment. A CrossFit gym is not just a normal gym where there's machinery where you can, go and do your workout in your own time. CrossFit gyms, to our eyes, when we started looking at them, looked very much, or that they had echoes of what you would expect to find in congregations. So I want to tell a story about CrossFit as an example of the way in which people are kind of creating new communities that are ostensibly secular, but nonetheless are doing spiritual or religious things in the lives of their participants. So CrossFit is a gym, as I mentioned. People go there to work out, right? You want to lose weight, you want to get stronger, whatever it is. But people don't just hang around for that. It is most known for its wildly evangelical culture. And there's an old joke that goes, how do you know if someone does CrossFit, is vegan, or went to Harvard? And the answer is, they'll tell you. Because people are very, very enthusiastic about their lives being changed by CrossFit and wanting to change your lives with CrossFit. So there's an evangelical culture that's really baked into the whole enterprise. The workouts that they do are a combination of, maybe burpees, maybe going for a mile run, lifting weights, and each workout of the day, as they call it, a workout of the day, is a different combination of these moves. And what was interesting was that some of these workouts of the days are named after servicemen and women who have died in the line of battle, if they were in the military, in the police force, firefighters. So there's an honoring of the fallen that happens through their ritual behavior, through the movements that they do in their workouts. There's a real sense from the very top of the organization that the way you show up in the gym is the way you show up in life. And so there's a real focus on sort of ethical formation, that you learn how to do hard things by working out in tough workouts, and that will make you a stronger, more resilient, more courageous person in life outside of the gym. So it's not just a place of physical formation, it's a place of ethical formation. You see a sort of a kind of subculture within the CrossFit world is very much oriented around different diets that they follow. So the paleo diet, for example, is one. And if you think in a Jewish context where dietary laws were one of the main ways in which Jews through history were able to say, we are not them, it was by eating or not eating certain foods and separating themselves from the non-Jews, for example. It was a way of maintaining the tradition, maintaining the tribe. So a sort of spiritual technology of what food we eat and what food we don't eat that marks us out to be us and not them. The same is true at CrossFit. So you see all of these kind of echoes of religious life. People are going to their CrossFit gym to get married. They're approaching their fitness instructors to help them navigate a divorce or a difficult diagnosis or the death of a loved one. So there's sort of a pastoral role that these fitness instructors are suddenly having to carry for the people that they serve. Again, the very top of CrossFit talks about shepherding a flock, right? So you see this kind of religious imagery coming through and how they think about their members. And once a year, they all gather for the CrossFit Games, of course, pre-COVID. They would all gather for the CrossFit Games in a sort of pilgrimage of the faithful. And on the one hand, you can say, oh, isn't that interesting? It's a little strange, but not very important. The reason why I think it is important is because these communities become the central meaning-making structure for the lives of the most devoted members. If someone is sick, there are meal plans created. If someone needs a ride to the hospital or their dog looking after while they're away on vacation, these are the people that they turn to. People meet their partners here. They bring their kids there. There are workout groups for young mums who are struggling with postpartum depression. There are improv nights where people share their talents, playing the cello for the first time in 20 years. So these are communities that gather ritually over time. They celebrate Thanksgiving together. So these, again, are not just places where people go to get fit. They are replicating many, many of the functions that you might have seen in congregational life. So in some ways, I think what we're seeing at a CrossFit, having kind of unbundled and remixed, people kind of rebundling into a new community like this one. I want to share one other story, and then we'll go back to the macro. Another example of a community that we found in our research that is ostensibly completely secular, but nonetheless repeats a lot of things that you might expect to see in a religious congregation. This organization is called the Dinner Party. And it's not just any dinner party, and I will show my face so you can see me while I'm talking rather than just a lovely picture. The Dinner Party is an organization primarily for people in their 20s and 30s who have experienced significant loss. So they might have had a sibling pass away. They might have had a parent or another loved one die. And as a younger person, have experienced that loss as a sort of a conversation killer, a sense that other people maybe don't understand their experience, and they want to be in a place where they can talk authentically about the fullness of their emotions in life after loss. So not only grief, but perhaps sadness or relief or anger, right? A place where all of everything is welcome. So these are folks that get matched online. You kind of enter your details. You get matched online to a table in your town, in your city, and you show up with some food to someone's house, and you sit down for essentially a potluck, but with a structured conversation around the experience of grief and loss. And what happened in these communities is, of course, it's a place of accompaniment, it's a place of healing and memorializing, but it's also a place, especially after the 2016 election, that became politically active. And so they started to use this organizing principle of sharing a meal together to try and bring Republicans and Democrats to share a meal, not to talk about politics, but to build relationships, which would then start to explore more difficult conversations that otherwise wouldn't have been able to happen. So you see a sort of civic engagement in a community that was supposed to be about grief, but now is suddenly engaging with questions of democracy. We saw over and over again how the leaders of this community, again, were being put into a pastoral role. Folks coming to them, asking them how to navigate an addiction. Folks in the most serious and sad situations, when a member of a table, and these folks meet regularly over time, so they really start to form kind of small groups that are known and loved by one another. When one of those members committed suicide, very sadly, of course, a very re-traumatizing experience for everyone who's already gathered in grief, they turn to these leaders to help them navigate an immediate loss, to organize everything from the memorial service to how to think about this in their own lives. There's the ritual sharing of food, right? There's so many things that you can already see how they echo traditional religious communities. So again, there is a real sense that this is a secular space that is doing religious things in the lives of its participants. So you can see spiritual accompaniment, ritual sharing of food. It's a small group, memorializing of the dead. But those are only two organizations in a landscape of secular organizations that are doing religious things in the lives of its participants. There are adult summer camps in which people leave behind their day-to-day identity. They are forcibly told to turn off their phones. The phones are collected. They invent a sort of a new character for themselves. And in a sort of carnival-esque period of a week, they re-enter a space of play and creativity. The Harry Potter Alliance, which is an organization which inspired a lot of my work with the podcast, The Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, mobilizes people who are fans of the Harry Potter novels into real world justice movements. So getting them involved, especially for these, this is an organization that works especially with people that might not necessarily have been activists, but want to put into practice the values that they care about because of the books that they love. So they were very involved, for example, in marriage equality, fair trade chocolate, kind of, you might say, entry-level issues on questions of justice, but nonetheless, using a narrative and the images and the stories and the characters of those narratives to mobilize people for real-world social justice action. Soul Cycle is an organization that might be familiar with you all, another fitness example, but this one was so striking to me for a number of reasons. First of all, the clue is in the name, Soul Cycle. This is an organization that is very consciously speaking to that spiritual part of its client base to say that this is a place where you can reconnect with what really matters. And if you've ever been to a Soul Cycle class, you will know it is a liturgical experience. You're entering a spin class ostensibly, but the lights are turned down. the music is blaring, you're on a stationary bicycle, kind of organized around one where the leader sits, which is raised on a platform, which is illuminated from below. And the leader is not telling you to cycle faster or slower. They're asking questions like, who are you riding for today? What do you want to, what do you want to let go of? So these are meaning-making questions, which through the kind of exhaustion of the physical exercise have a particular resonance with the riders, because they're kind of in a vulnerable space in which they can engage this feeling. And there's a little bit of a phenomenon that happens towards the end of the 45-minute liturgy, and they really do organize it as such. The hill climb, which is the penultimate song in the playlist, is always a slower song. So you dial up the resistance on the bike, so you really have to push. And it's often kind of like a fabulous 80s ballad or something, kind of a slower song. And the phenomenon is that everyone starts crying. There's just this sense of like collective release. So there's this sense of collective effervescence, you might say, that happens in these fitness communities that again has a sense of transcendence or a sense of spirituality that comes through. So I illustrate these only as other little dots on a map of what I think is a whole new generation of organizations that are replacing in some ways, at least in part, what we used to find in congregations. I'll mention one final example just because I adore it so much. And we talked about the social fabric, the relational fabric being unwound. Thread in Baltimore is just a fabulous example of how to counter that kind of trend. So this is an organization that ostensibly, again, its stated purpose is kind of different from what ends up happening. Its stated purpose, and they do this, of course, is to support young people who are at risk of dropping out of high school. So mostly poorer kids who often have an unstable domestic situation. Poverty has an impact in all sorts of ways on their lives. And the strategy is simply to have 4 adults, 4 volunteers, love the child and do everything that they would do for their own kids for this child. And it's extraordinary because, of course, with 4 adults who make that kind of commitment, through those years of middle school and high school, these kids always make it. It's wonderful. They often go into college and continue to prosper. But what I love about Thread is they don't just measure the impact on the individual student, they also measure the impact on those volunteers, because those are usually wealthier, but also often newcomers to the city. So these are people who have lots of opportunity, but not a lot of community. And through this kind of new social fabric, this new a woven set of relationships, because of course they're in touch with the 3 other adults as well as the young person. They form these kind of new familial structures, and they themselves are enriched by that experience. So you see a kind of multiple levels of impact. And again, repeating some of that intergenerational connection that we'd expect to see in a congregation, as well as a small group of commitment over time. So a lovely example. If you're not familiar with Thread, I highly recommend that you learn a little bit more about them. And so my work at Harvard Divinity School over the last number of years has been to learn about these communities and to gather them together. Because one thing that we realized is that these kind of communities often don't have the support infrastructure that traditional religious kind of innovators might have, right? These CrossFit instructors have never had any theological education. These dinner party hosts don't have a bishop that they can call for help. And I don't just mean in a kind of a way that they might need to when navigating a theological question. All the problems that happen in congregations happen in these communities too. Whether it's an instructor having a romantic relationship with a client, whether it's financial crises, whether it's the sudden loss of a community leader, all of those things are happening here as well. So we've been trying to understand what are the kind of support systems, or you might say, what is the infrastructure of the future of spiritual community in the United States that needs to be built in order to sustain these communities. And this is a gathering we hosted just a few years ago at Harvard Divinity School, where we had about 80 of those leaders come together. So it's a rapidly changing landscape, because of course, as soon as these things are created, many of them also really struggle, and they often rely on an individual kind of founder to sustain them for some time. And many of them don't find a sustainable financial model and then crash. So it's a very, very quickly changing landscape. But the thing that I want you to take away before we start having some conversation in just a moment is that when we look at these statistics, when we look at the trends, especially the disaffiliation religiously, it's easy to think that, oh, younger people are all atheists, right? They don't care about spirituality, they don't care about community. And what we have found in our research is that that is not true, that it is absolutely the case that the longing for connection, even for spiritual community, is as strong as ever, but it's the distribution system that is no longer quite fit for purpose for a growing number of people. So it's the structure of the place-based congregation as we have known it. That's where the challenge is. It's not the longing of young people. And so we're seeing a whole new generation of new, I think, spiritual communities emerging that are responding to that need, whether overtly or kind of implicitly. And I think we're only going to see more of them, especially in this moment where so many people are experiencing that sense of disconnection more than ever. So if you're feeling worried about the state of community life in America, my hope is that you will look around your community with different eyes to start looking for what might be some of these seeds of future spiritual communities that might not look religious, but in some ways are fulfilling the same purposes that a traditional congregation has. So those are some, I hope, stimulating thoughts to kind of get us started. And I would love to hear from you in the chat if there are reflections that resonate for you, that you recognize from your own experience, if there are things that challenge you that don't make sense, or that you have a different idea about, and then also what questions you might have. So I can see some of you already getting busy in the chat, which is wonderful. Yes, absolutely. Okay, Barry asks, established purveyors of products that have been successful for a long time often have great difficulty changing their product. Absolutely, this is the innovator's dilemma. Would you characterize mainline religious institutions in this way? And have you seen examples of some of them that seem to be adapting successfully? Really excellent question, Barry. So what Barry's pointing to is that institutions can really struggle to adapt to a changing context. And so mainline religious institutions that were designed for one time period, I mean, literally with buildings, often that were designed for one context, and now having to adjust very, very quickly to an internet age where all of these changes are happening. And I would say, Barry, you're right, that a lot of congregations are struggling. You know, the United Methodists, for example, honestly can't keep up with the rate at which they need to close their churches. So you see a lot of pain and a lot of sadness within religious institutions. But there are some examples that to me are very exciting of a religious leader, particularly ones that have often a little bit more authority, who are able to think very creatively about the future. So as I take a sip of water, I'll tell you a little bit about that. One of my favorite examples is a woman named Carol Zinn, who is now the executive director of the umbrella organization for all of America's, nearly all of America's Catholic nuns. It's the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. So she's responsible for an incredible group of as they're known, women religious, of Catholic sisters. And of course, for people who are monastics, they are at the very, very sharp end of this trend. You know, they used to be a couple of 100,000 Catholic nuns just 150 years ago. At this point, it's more like 40,000, and the average age is 70 plus. And so it is very, very clear that, as Carol says, that particular expression of religious life is no longer connecting in a culturally relevant way. You know, there's mostly the young women who are signing up to become nuns are have grown up in Africa or India or outside the United States in the majority. And so she's very clear that it's not about like trying to revive the way in which Catholic sisters have lived, right? Working in hospitals, teachers, whatever it is. But the way she said it, and I find this so beautiful, is that for her, and I'm going to use her language here, Christian language, she says, religious life is about a radical response to the call of the gospel. But it's always a particular historical and cultural context in the way that's expressed. And she said, I know that our expression, our historical and cultural context, the expression we have is dying, but I still believe in the radical response to the gospel. And so the way she says it is that her job is to try and pay attention, where are there new expressions of responses to the gospel that are aligned with their charism, right, with their tradition, with their calling. And one such example, which is just so lovely, over the last 3 years, 4 years now, there's been groups of nuns, N-U-N-S, and nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those folks who tick none of the above when they're asked about their religious affiliation. And these people have been coming together at a local level for nuns and nuns conversation. And it's wonderful not only to see the intergenerational friendships and learning that's happened from both sides, but now the way in which they're building new projects. So for example, 6 millennials moved into an old novitiate in California. They're now running a national Get Out the Vote campaign. There's all sorts of really wonderful examples of the collaborations that are happening across these different paradigms. So I hope that's one example. There's also some I should say, wonderful examples of more traditional kind of innovations within religious life, whether you look at new communities like The Kitchen in San Francisco, wonderful Jewish community. Whether you look, of course, at all sorts of new tech products. There's a wonderful app called Soul Time, run out of the UK, where I think there's some really good innovation happening in the language that people are using. Because at this point, the cultural gap has grown so much that for people who are maybe interested in meditation or something gentle, kind of little dipping in the toe of spiritual life, but very, very wary of religious institutions, the languages that they speak are so different that it's very hard to hear one another or to understand what the words are. So just another one of the challenges between those two. Okay, the questions are coming in thick and fast, so I want to respond to a couple more. Fantastic. Okay, we've got Kelly asking, oh, Janet, yes, I didn't mention the impact of COVID, in part because it's still a little too soon to tell, honestly. We know that more and more people, people are working longer hours. We know that people are their relationships have shifted because of COVID. So one way that I would think about it is that our relational pool, certainly at the beginning, really shrunk. So we're spending more and more time with the people that we live with or who are nearby, which, I've never spent as much time with my husband as I have over the last 6 months. So the kind of relational pool has shrunk and deepened, but at the same time, we've lost a lot of the serendipitous or the more casual connections or even interactions with strangers that might have been a sweet moment of connection. So one of the kind of relational design challenges that we're in right now is that we need new things to do with the people we spend all our time with. And we need unstructured, joyful little moments of interaction with strangers that can't be scheduled on Zoom, because of course that immediately undercuts the experience of serendipity. So I think it's too soon to tell, but certainly about the long-term impact on our mental health because of the shutdowns. But it is no doubt going to have an enormous impact. Patricia, has the link between conservative religious communities and right-wing politics hurt or put a nail in the coffin for religious millennials, or for religious affiliation for many millennials and Gen Xers? Patricia, this is a very, very insightful question. The 1990s especially, and even early 2000s, you saw organizations like Focus on the Family and the Moral Majority really polarize the language of religion, and I would say weaponize it. So that for folks who might have been casual Catholics or people who might have said, well, I'm kind of Lutheran, I don't really attend anything, but that's what I grew up with. And they might, before the 90s, still have identified or affiliated with that specific religion or that specific religious identity. As those kind of right-wing organizations were polarizing the language and the even theology of Christianity in particular, more and more people were like, I don't want to be represented by that. And the kind of anti-gay, anti-women rhetoric was extremely, if you think about it in brand terms, it made it a toxic brand, especially for people on the progressive and politically. So you're absolutely right to point to that as a driving force of why we see the sudden decline in identification, not necessarily in belief or practice, although there are changes there too, but that drastic change in how people identified. I think you're absolutely right to mention that. What's really interesting is when, as you point to Gen Xers and certainly with boomers, people who have left religion, it was often an experience of hurt, a sense of being personally, experiencing something that really pushed people away from religious communities. What's interesting is with younger generations, more and more people, honestly, like myself, didn't grow up with anything in the first place. So there isn't that sense of intense betrayal, perhaps, but it's sort of just a an absence, an irrelevance. And so the kind of a hunger for spirituality, or the hunger for deep community, is expressed differently. And people are actually very open, once they feel safe, to engage in religious practices. So one example is the podcast I co-host, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where we apply traditional Jewish and Christian reading practices with the Harry Potter books. And so we start with a thing that we love, which you could be religious or secular, doesn't matter. If you love the Harry Potter books, you're going to enjoy the podcast, I hope. But by reading them in this way, where we take one specific sentence and we might ask us a different set of questions about it, so you enter the text in a different way, we've ended up teaching, tens of thousands of people how to do text study that you might have learned to do in a religious congregation, but we've done it with Harry Potter. So you see there's a sort of a very different orientation and an openness, if it's relevant, if it's interesting, if it feels like it's helping you live the kind of life that you want. There's a real openness to religious practices. Okay, some more questions. Thank you for these thoughtful, smart questions. You're not disappointing. Let's have a look. Kate, do you know of any religious communities that are working together to meet the spiritual longing of youth? I know a lot of churches that are in partnerships with multiple Christian denominations, but what about multi-faith or interreligious communities? This is one of the real challenges for religious institutions, because a lot of them orient this question around how do we get the young people back? How do we get young people to come back, to come into our doors? And honestly, I think that is the wrong way to frame the question. Because it immediately places the centrality on the existing institutions. You have to get people through the threshold of the building, which is not easy, because all of that brand stuff that we were talking about, the assumptions that people have, especially about Christianity as the kind of cultural dominant religion in America. So there are definitely lots of efforts to try and get young people in. The initiatives that I'm most excited about orient the church not as the center, but as the active agent that is trying to come alongside young people. So that is putting the young people at the center and saying, how can we be of service to you? What are the things that we can support you in, the challenges you have? Because there's a huge, I think, generational gap in the assumptions about what the challenges are for younger people, especially Gen Zs at this point. If you want to see more about this, I highly recommend Springtide Research. It's an amazing new research organization that focuses specifically on Gen Zs. But I think one of the key framings that I would, if you're involved in this, I would really recommend is to not orientate the question to how do we get them back or how do they come to us, but how can we serve them in the lives that they're living. Okay, let's come to Kelly's question. How can we find balance between new distribution methods of spirituality for those who don't connect with a congregation and the people who are still showing up on Sunday mornings? Yeah, this is a beautiful question. I really want to make sure that I say, I'm thrilled if people are well served by their congregation. I in no way want to kind of bash or see the demise necessarily of congregations. The people I really care about are the folks who are not served by them. And so I'm always thinking about what's the infrastructure that will serve them. One of my favorite ways to think about this is in a kind of ecological metaphor. My friend and colleague, Lisa Greenwood at the United Methodist Development Fund talks about a mixed spiritual ecology. So rather than just seeing, religious life is organized by congregations, and of course, in that sense, a congregation that's a conservative synagogue or a Catholic church, they're pretty similar just in terms of the structure, a building, a weekly service, et cetera, et cetera. A more mixed spiritual ecology would see podcasts next to small group ministries, next to a place-based congregation, next to an annual kind of conventional pilgrimage, next to all sorts of different expressions that were each deemed legitimate and therefore integrated within a denominational framework. Including some of these kind of newer communities that are maybe built around food or fitness or whatever it is. So I think what is likely is that the same people won't attend both, but that if denominations and religious institutions can open their frameworks to include these and therefore support them, because by the way, those new community leaders don't necessarily have health insurance, right? If there's a way to include them, I think there's a much more, a higher likelihood of having a healthy, spiritually mixed ecology, as it were. Neil asks a really provocative question. How would you differentiate a cult from a smaller spiritual group or a group such as Soul Cycle? You know, the things I'm always immediately looking out for if there is a sense of cultishness. And some of these groups, these new communities really embrace that sense. CrossFit is one that says, if they call us a cult, great. You know, I want to be called a cult kind of thing. One of the things to look for immediately is if it's easy or is it as easy to exit as it is to enter, right? If there's any sort of sense that you want to draw people in, but then not let them out, that's an immediate red flag. Another way that you might look for kind of red flags in terms of cultish behavior are, you know, are people asked to do things that are not in their own interests, whether financially, physically, all sorts of things. You might look around a specific kind of charismatic leader. To what extent are they in positions of power that are not held to account? And I'm afraid we see this not only in these more secular organizations, but of course we see it in religious communities too. The systems of accountability are one of the most important in a healthy spiritual community. So those are some of the things that I would look out for. I think, Neil, your question also touches on a very important theme, which is the relationship between the market and capitalism and these new communities that are private companies. So if there is an incentive of profit before the well-being of people, where does that put the community? Now, I don't want to paint religion as somehow pure and not interested in money, because there's plenty to say about, you know, the $93 billion endowment in the Vatican. But nonetheless, I think these are questions that are connected to that cult question as well. All right, let's have one or two more. Ellen, what is the relationship of the current drag culture and the change, drug culture, I'm sorry, and the change in worship? Oh my goodness, I thought this was a question about drag queens, which I was very excited about, Ellen, but drug culture is an interesting one. You might have noticed, certainly this is true on the West Coast, the explosion of people exploring psychedelics. And the ayahuasca journeys are to a penny, certainly around Silicon Valley. You might have seen the Goop series on Netflix, perhaps earlier, or maybe that was last year, where you can see a real kind of embrace of kind of altered states as part of spiritual life, which of course has a rich heritage in all sorts of different cultural conditions. I am very suspicious of sort of religious tourism, and I think honestly that for a lot of these cases, it's folks who don't have necessarily a rich religious or spiritual life, certainly not necessarily a community, that are looking for access to an experience of transcendence, a meaningful experience. And this is sort of a shortcut there. Certainly when it's, you know, you're flying somewhere, you're taking part in a ceremony, you're flying home, right? There isn't integration, there isn't relationship. So I'm very, very hesitant about this trend. Now, I don't want to deny the rich experiences that people have, but a spiritual experience does not make a spiritual life. And I think there's an opportunity for folks to look at their own cultural heritage, to look for practices that might serve them. I think the power dynamics around indigenous culture being exploited and certainly being monetized in ways that make me feel very, very uneasy. So, but you're absolutely right to point to this as a trend in how people are experiencing their spirituality. Absolutely. Oh, I love that from Sarah. Conversely, are we seeing any trends in sobriety communities that are filling some of the holes of congregational life? Over and over again, people point to AA especially as what they wish church was. That's a phrase often I hear, that people share an authenticity, a relevance, a strength of relationship, a purpose of a role, like being a sponsor, in sobriety communities that is often unparalleled in kind of a usual congregation. One of my very, very favorite organizations in the sobriety world is an organization called Recovery Cafe in Seattle, run by a woman called Killian No, which I think is just the most beautiful example of how a shared experience of rock bottom or an awareness of our own, you know, inherent failures in life can bring people together in compassion and real transformative, life-changing relationships and situations. So absolutely, I think recovery communities is a great one. And I think there's an interesting invitation for us to think about, you know, if rock bottom is the entry point into a community of that depth and of that commitment, is it possible to design invitations into similar communities without sharing that rock bottom experience outside of a sobriety context? You know, are there life moments, perhaps when people become parents, perhaps when they get married, perhaps if they lose their job, right? Are there other moments of invitation into community that might build that kind of authentic and committed and loving relationship? I think that's one of the biggest kind of design challenges, if you will, for both secular and religious institutions today. Friends, I feel like I have just talked minute to minute. These were fantastic questions, and I so appreciate your thoughtful reflections. Thanks for joining in the polls. Thanks for being here this evening. I want to echo Mary's invitation to support the forum. These things don't just happen. There's lots of work happening behind the scenes, and it doesn't happen for free. So thank you to Mary, thank you Troy, Marissa, everyone involved, Lee, this evening. And I'm so grateful to have been with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Casper. You've just been fantastic. We're so pleased that you joined us tonight. For everyone watching, please stay on if you want to see the details about our upcoming talk so you can put it into your calendar. Remember, you can pick up or you can order Casper's book, The Power of Ritual, Turning Everyday Activities into Soulful Practices at Oblong's Book and Music in Millington. And we wish you a wonderful weekend. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.